Hi, Peridot. Peridot. Hi, Cornelia. Guys gonna fall asleep to some stories. Gotta find a couple. Happy birthday, Peridot. I mean, Peridot. Captain Lee. Hi, Fazia. Wan Wu. Hi, Taco. Kathy. Haley. Kathy from Texas. Okay. Hi, Elizabeth T. Okay, we're going to read The Princess's Curse. Hi, Nana Patty. How's your knee? I know you had an accident. Hi, Laura Lee. You go to the doctor. Don't you go tomorrow or something? Or soon to get an MRI and a CAT scan? I don't know, Charlia Ann. I can try though. Auction tomorrow. Okay, Nana Patty. Is it feeling any better at all, Nana Patty? Or is it about the same? Can't believe you fell on that knee. Terrible. Yeah, she tripped over the little puppy, I guess. Or tried not to fall on her, or did a little bit, but not much. On the knee she just had replaced. Peridot. Drink lots of water, Peridot. Oh, yeah, Nana Patty, of course. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started so you guys can get nice and rested. And me too, okay? The Princess's Curse from Death Valley National Park in California. Many a long year ago, there lived a queen who ruled over a lovely valley hemmed in by steep mountains. Good, Peridot. Her kingdom was a peaceful one, and her subjects thrived under her rule. One summer, the queen fell in love with a brave and strong warrior. The couple was married within a fortnight of their first meeting. The queen's happiness spread to her people and her land. Thanks, Kevin. The fertile valley seemed to glow with joy, so that even the goods traded with other kingdoms had a bit of that radiance and were valued more highly than those from other lands. To the queen's delight, a daughter was born to herself and her consort. The infant had the beautiful large eyes of a doe and a smile that touched the deepest places within the soul. She was beloved by all. The people of the valley counted themselves privileged if they so much as caught a glimpse of the little princess. When she, hey Taco, when she was still quite small, the little princess fell ill with a fever. Her parents sat with her night and day for a week before her fever broke. The day the medicine man declared the princess out of danger, the queen wept aloud with joy and relief. The little princess was slow to grow strong again. She no longer ran and played in the beautiful gardens and pathways of the valley, but was content to stay at home and embroider or practice on the little pipe her father had given her as a gift. The queen was alarmed by the change in her daughter and insisted that the child take numerous herbs and potions brewed by the medicine man, but none of them restored the little princess's strength. She remained a fragile, delicate jewel whom people treasured even more than before. When the princess was 16, her father was killed in a hunting accident. The queen was distraught and locked herself away in her room for many days. When she finally emerged, she was changed. The sweet openness of her manner was gone, replaced by a coldness that the princess had never seen before. Lisa, I hope you're here listening. Outwardly, things went on normally in the Valley Kingdom. However, the glow of happiness had left the queen and her people, never to return. The grief of having lost not one, but both of her parents, made the princess more fragile than ever. The cooks made every delicacy they could think of to tempt her royal appetite, but she ate sparingly and grew pale and sickly. The princess watched with alarm as her mother's gaze turned outward toward other lands as if she were seeking something to fill the void left by the death of her husband. And finally, the queen did find a new project to engage her interest. The Aztecs to the south had built great palaces and created many treasures. The queen decided that she would surpass them all. That very day, the queen commissioned all the best builders and workers of timber and stone in the valley to build her a palace, such as had never been seen before. Soon the valley was filled with the crash of falling trees. The beautiful pathways became ugly dirt roads down which large stones and timber were dragged. Foundations were laid for a huge, magnificent palace. The queen was pleased and smiled for the first time since her consort's death. As days and weeks turned to months, the queen grew impatient. The palace was taking shape too slowly. She commanded more of her people to help with the work, carrying stones, dragging timbers, and aiding the skilled workers. All other work in the valley ground to a halt. The palace was the only thing that occupied the waking moments of the queen and her people. The princess went to her mother and protested the treatment of the people. The queen shouted at her daughter and commanded her never to speak disparagingly of the palace project again within her hearing. From then henceforth, the princess was no longer allowed to enter her mother's presence without being directly summoned by the queen. The queen grew angry because the project slowed at mealtime. She forced the people to work in shifts and begrudged the time that the men took to hunt and the women took to cook, insisting that they continue working on the new palace by torchlight far into the night. And still, the work was too slow for the queen. What the heck did this queen want? My gosh. She took to strolling among the workers, a whip cradled in her beautiful hands, and she lashed the backs of any man or woman who was not working with the industry she required. The princess was enraged by the queen's treatment of the people. Defying her mother's command, she boldly came before the queen and berated her for her cruelty. The queen struck the princess across the face, and had locked her in her room until she learned to respect the royal decrees of her parent. The princess remained a prisoner for many days with only stale bread to eat and water to drink until the queen at long last relented and released her. The queen's blow and the lack of food had taken its toll on the delicate health of the princess. She lay ill for many days following her release. The queen took no notice of the princess's health and refused to send for the medicine man or allow anyone to nurse her. Oh, Nana Patty, I didn't forget about paying you. I didn't get a message from you. Let me know exactly how much it is, okay? Close to a year after the start of her project, the queen began having the same dream each night. In the dream, she lay on her bed, dying of fever, her palace half completed. She was all alone, with none to comfort her. The queen was frightened by her dream. She would not die before her palace was finished. She ordered all the children of her people to work with their parents on the palace, even those who had just learned to walk. Well, that'd be crazy. What could a little baby do? At this At this last monstrosity, the princess rebelled. Rising from her sick bed, she came before the queen, begging her to have mercy on the children. Infuriated, the queen had the princess dragged out to the work site and forced her to work side by side with the people. The queen stood nearby, watching as the men, women, and children toiled in the hot summer sun. Anyone who slowed down felt the touch of her whip across his or her back. One warrior tried to take the heavy burden from the princess, whose fever had returned and was climbing steadily. The queen had the warrior beheaded where he stood, and then she beat her daughter with the whip until the princess fell to the ground, the lotus stones tumbling from her arms. The princess lay trembling on the ground, her back a mass of welts and blood. Okay. Drawing on the last of her strength, the girl rose shakily to her feet and confronted her mother. "A curse I lay upon you," she cried, "and upon this valley. May it wither and die as the love for your people has withered and died away, never to return. Your palace, your people, and your kingdom will perish ere your palace is complete." She fell to her knees as she proclaimed the last words, and then pitched forward and lay dead at her mother's feet. The queen stared down at the lifeless form of her daughter. Slowly, the whip fell from her hand. Above her, the heat from the sun trebled as her daughter's curse took immediate effect. A rebellious murmuring was heard from the workers. They considered royalty, hi Mary, sacred, and so had obeyed their queen without question. But matters grew confused when the sacred destroyed the sacred. The heat from the sun blasted down upon the worksite as the queen knelt and gathered the body of her daughter into her arms. She did not seem to notice that one by one her workers were abandoning the site. Those men whose strength had not yet been defeated by the project packed up their families at once and left the valley, but many of the people were too weak to flee the cursed valley. Day after day, as the queen sat alone in her house, weeping over the body of her daughter, the people watched the valley die around them. The water dried up, the trees and grass withered, and the animals disappeared. Yeah. Sorry. Just can't get this right. The very old and the very young perished first, followed by the rest. At last, only the queen remained, lying on her bed, dying of fever. She dragged herself out to her half completed palace and lay with the terrible hot sun beating down upon her until she breathed her last. To this day, the half completed palace of Death Valley may be seen in the shimmering mirage that sometimes appears on the horizon in the heat of the burning sun. The Corpse Walker, Sierra Nevada. My uncle Ling went to make his fortune in the gold fields of the Sierra Nevada. He had been restless ever since the death of his wife, my Aunt Bick. Theirs had been an arranged marriage, but the love that had arisen between them was deep as the sea. Even though I was quite small when Aunt Bick died, I remembered how her house seemed to sing with happiness. I watched while Uncle Ling packed his things. He told me stories of the old days when he and Aunt Bick lived in China. Oh, I wonder if these are any of my long lost relatives, ancestors. His voice trembled a bit when he said his wife's name. I wonder if a woman would ever love me as much as my aunt had loved my uncle. I was not sure if I was comfortable with that idea. After all, look how terribly unhappy my uncle was after she died. Perhaps it was better to be comfortably married like my parents. I shook my head and decided not to worry about it. Marriage was still a long way off. I said this aloud to Uncle Ling, and he smiled. Not too far off now, Shen. I hope you will find happiness as great as that I had with Bick. He patted me on the head and went to speak to my father. Upon his departure, Uncle Ling begged my parents for one promise. If anything should happen to him, his last wish was to be buried beside his beloved wife. My father solemnly assured him that he would honor his request. Satisfied, he bowed to each of us and left for the gold fields. We did not hear from my uncle again for many months. Then one day, a man came to our door. He wore the rough clothes of a miner, and his face was grim and sad. Uncle Ling had fallen to his death, he told us, away up in the mountains. The trail where he was found was steep and narrow, and so they had buried him there rather than risk another life by bringing him down the mountain. My father and mother exchanged glances. I knew they were remembering the promise made to my uncle. My father valued his honor above all things. I knew he would do whatever it took to bring my uncle's body home, no matter what the cost to himself or his family. For my father, it was a matter of honor. At my father's request, the miner made a map showing us where they had buried my uncle. Then he departed. What will we do, Father? I asked, even though I knew what his response would be. I made a promise to your uncle that he would be buried beside his wife. I will not dishonor him or myself by breaking that promise, my father said. I will go and bring him down. Father left the next morning and was gone for 3 days. He returned without the body of my uncle. The path on which my uncle had met his fate was even more treacherous than the miner had described. It was so narrow in places that a man had to inch along sideways, holding on to the cliff face to reach the ground on the other side. My father could not carry my uncle out. Then we must find a walker, my mother said firmly. My father blanched at the thought, though he nodded his head slowly and told my mother he would make inquiries. I was curious. I had never before heard of a walker. When Father left the house, I asked my mother what a walker was. Back in China, some of the holy monks are called corpse walkers, my mother said. When a person dies, the body they leave behind becomes an empty shell. That is why we bury them so quickly. so no evil spirit can take over the body. But sometimes, like in your uncle's situation, it's necessary to move a body that is nearly unreachable. When this happens, one of the monks places part of his spirit into the body and walks it to a place where it can be safely transported. Your father is going to find a corpse walker to bring out your uncle's body. I shivered. It sounded horrible. Father came back late that night. He had found a corpse walker. Both repulsed and curious, I asked Father if I could accompany them on their mission to retrieve my uncle's body. It's no place for a child, my father said firmly, but I was his only son, and he indulged almost all of my whims. With a little persistence, I persuaded him that I should come along. We traveled for a day and a half up into the steepest parts of the Sierra Nevada. Finally, the trail became so narrow that we abandoned the cart. The path was only wide enough for one person to walk at a time. We climbed single file for nearly a half hour. Finally, we reached the ledge that Father had described. I inched across it sideways with my heels out over a very high drop, my hands clutching the rocks in front of me for dear life. My heart pounded and my legs trembled so much I thought I would fall. Pride alone kept my mouth shut and forced me past the narrow place. I didn't look down. My uncle was buried a few yards away from the ledge. Together, my father and the monk dug up his body. He had already begun to decay, and the smell was terrible. They laid his body on the ground. Then the monk closed his eyes for a moment. I got the impression that he was focusing his mind on my uncle's body. Suddenly, the body twitched. I jumped backward in shock. Can you believe this? People from my country can do this. The eyes opened, and my uncle slowly rose to his feet. Loose earth dropped from his clothing, but he did not brush it away as a living man would. I felt my flesh creep at the sight. There was nothing alive about him. His eyes were open, but there was no spirit looking out of them. His body did not stand erect as it had in life. It sagged a bit to one side. Excuse me. Probably where his bones had fallen in the fall, I surmised. The monk opened his eyes and motioned to my father and me to precede him, back over the ledge and down the path to the cart. Father went first, carefully inching along the narrow ledge. I followed, keeping my eyes on the cliff face until I was safely past the drop. Then I looked back. The monk was moving carefully along the narrow ledge, his face pressed against the rock in front of him. Behind him, sliding along just as carefully, came my uncle's body. Clods of earth broke away from his clothing and fell down, down, down into the canyon below. The monk stepped onto firm ground, followed by my uncle's corpse. It trailed the monk down the path, hopping stiffly behind him. I kept turning around to gaze at the body in horrified fascination. Once I bumped into my father in front of me, he told me rather sharply to behave myself. After that, I looked only ahead until we reached the place where we had left the cart. The monk walked directly over to the cart, and my uncle's body followed him. At a gesture from the monk, the body climbed into the cart and lay down. The monk closed his eyes for a moment. My uncle's body shuddered and then was still. The monk opened his eyes and clutched at the side of the cart for support. It had taken a great deal out of him to bring my uncle's corpse so far. My father was ready for a flask of tea and some food. When the monk had eaten and drunk, we both we drove down the mountain with my uncle's body. We buried Uncle Ling next to Aunt Vic just as we promised. Let's see. Probably only going to read one more because all of a sudden my neck's hurting and I'm tired. Um, let's see. The Serpent out of Lake Tahoe. I know you said you've been there, Kevin. I know I've been to part of it. The part that's in, you're welcome, Cornelia. This will probably be the last one here, the Serpent. Make it a short night since it's late. I was at Lake Tahoe, that was in Nevada, when we went to visit my uncle out in Reno. Well, now, after the war, I settled myself down on the west shore of Lake Tahoe, built a cabin, bought me a hunting rifle, and got the pick of the litter from my neighbor's setter dog. That's right, you did, Kevin. We'll just spot like that. Thanks, Nana Patty. I know I will. It's just from sitting here for a while, you know. I may head down doing this, the blanket thingy, years ago, Kevin. Well, still, that's cool, though. Figured I would retire and spend my days hunting and fishing. Me and Jake, my setter, would roam up and down the shores of the lake and then wander back into the hills, hunting and sometimes just walking about, enjoying each other's company. My Sally, may she rest in peace, was a bit of a chatterbox, and I cherished the silence, since I reckon I'd heard enough conversation to last me a couple of lifetimes. Oh, that's terrible. Jake didn't say much, him being a dog, but we managed quite well together. He liked to sit in the boat and watch the water while I fished. I won't say he held the net for me every time I landed a big one, but he always passed it to me, which amounted to the same thing. I didn't have any near neighbors, so the only socializing I got was when I went into town. I'd been in my new home for a few months when I heard a few folks in the local grocery store talking about a serpent. Taco, are you? Cornelia. And Elizabeth thinks she has glue in her hair. And Peridot's kayaked here on Lake Tahoe. Now, serpent is an old fashioned sort of word. Most people hear about call the slithery critters snakes. I was intrigued and did some eavesdropping to find out what they were talking about. After hearing only a few sentences, I hurried away, made my purchases, and left the store. As soon as I was out of earshot, I bent double laughing until I cried. They were talking about a sea serpent in Lake Tahoe. Jake bounced about, barking excitedly. He wanted to be in on the joke, I guess. I kept chuckling to myself all the way home. These old timers sure did have good imaginations. Did you guys ever hear about a serpent when you were there? The summer passed, and autumn blazed across the lake country. The days and nights were chilled indeed, but that didn't stop Jake and me from hunting and fishing every chance we got. Early one morning, when the sun's light was glowing through the mist that rose off the lake, Jake and I set out to hunt for grouse. I'd spotted some near one of the creeks that fed into the lake, and I was aiming to bring back a dozen before the day was through. As I combed the brush, I heard a loud crashing sound coming from the mouth of a nearby canyon. Jake barked sharply as the ground started to shake. Suddenly, a flock of quail burst forth, flying right past my face, nearly blinding me with their feathers. They were followed by more rabbits than I could count. The bunnies were hopping just about as fast as I'd ever seen, rushing by me without taking any notice of my hunting dog or my gun. Jake and I were so startled by the strange migration that we stood stock still and just watched. The rabbits were soon joined by a pack of coyotes. I always thought coyotes ate rabbits, but these fellows were too busy running to bother. I was becoming uncomfortable with the scene before me. These animals were frightened. You could feel the fear coming off of them in waves. A herd of deer had joined the throng, and they were stumbling over the rabbits and each other in their determination to exit the canyon. Jake's hair was standing on end, and his tail was tucked under his body. It would not take much more to spook my setter, and the sight of two huge bears loping through the mouth of the canyon did the trick. Jake gave a yelp of terror and fled with the other animals. The bears passed by so close to me that I could have reached out and touched them if I dared, but from the look in their dark eyes, the very last thing I wanted to do was get between them and their destination. My arms were covered in goosebumps, which was strange because I was sweating fiercely. It occurred to me that a thing that even bears feared was something I did not want to meet. Almost without conscious volition, my feet carried me over to the nearest spruce tree, and I found myself climbing up as high as I could. The thickness of the branches covered my hiding spot. I watched as the last of the strange migration petered out, leaving an eerie quiet behind. No birds chirping, no rustle of small animals moving in the underbrush. There was just the cool touch of the wind and the silence. Then I heard it, the scraping sound of something very large sliding, or should I say slithering, over rocks and stone, tree roots and other debris littering the floor of the canyon. Scrape, swish, slither. An ancient terror filled me. I could feel my hair stand on end, and my clothes were soaked with sweat. My arms were shaking so hard I could barely cling to the tree branches. The sound grew nearer, and then I saw a wide, flat head with pitless dark eyes appear in the mouth of the canyon. It was a serpent, the largest serpent I had ever seen. It was thicker than a sequoia and longer than a house. It was mostly black. They are cool drawings, aren't they? With some dull orange markings along its side. I held my breath as it slowly slithered out of the canyon. It stopped for just a moment and raised its wide head. The cold black eyes looked this way and that, searching for something. I hoped it wasn't me. My body had frozen in terror. I didn't make a sound. Then the head lowered again, and the serpent undulated down the creek, heading toward the lake. Cautiously, very cautiously, I turned and watched it slither along, passing right over small saplings and dislodging very large rocks as it passed. A foolish quail that had not fled with its companions erupted suddenly from a bush. With a lazy snap of its giant mouth, the serpent swallowed it right out of the air. Then it slid into the lake and began swimming toward the far end. I watched its graceful movements through the water until it submerged. I didn't come down from the tree for a very long time. It was more than an hour later when I heard a familiar whine from the foot of the tree. Jake sat beneath me and wagged his tail apologetically. My mind came back from whatever faraway place the fear had taken me, and I slowly let go of the tree limb and slid down to join my dog. Jake thrust his nose into my hand for his comfort as well as my own. I cleared my throat a couple of times and said, "Well then, Jake, what do you think about moving somewhere a little less hazardous to our health?" Jake whined again, which I took as agreement. Within a week, I had sold my cabin, and Jake and I went to live near the coast. Apart from the occasional sea lion that tried to take up residence on my fishing boat, we lived a peaceful and happy life. We never went back to Lake Tahoe again. Got here just in time to say goodbye, Deborah. Mark this one off. Thank you guys for coming. Really appreciate it. Try not to have spooky dreams. See y'all tomorrow at the auction. Oh, you're welcome, Tracy. I thank all you guys for coming to listen. Thank you. Bye.